So after the last video, I got a lot of requests to go over some of the other panels that I wrote about in my master's dissertation and talk a little bit more about the synagogue at Huqoq. So we're going to do at least one more. Maybe if people want, we can do all of them. And so the panel that I want to talk about today is really the first thing that a worshiper walking into the Huqoq synagogue would see. And again, if you want to learn more about the synagogue in general and a little bit of the background, I would encourage you to watch the last video that I posted, which was more of an introduction. We talked about one of the panels there. But as you walk in, the first image that you would have seen as a worshiper would be this depiction of the Tower of Babel. The story of the Tower of Babel is recorded in the Bible. It's only 9 verses long, and the basic gist of the story is that the people of the world come together to build a high tower, and God is offended by this attempt to build the tower and comes in and mixes up all of their languages. So the tradition is that he creates 72 different languages and that they were no longer able to communicate with one another. And so the building project failed ultimately. And I think that that's a really interesting story to include as the entryway to this synagogue in particular, because the story itself seems to be an admonishment of a sort of collaborative, multi-ethnic building project. But that's exactly what this synagogue would have been. So it was built for the Jewish community, but the mosaics would have been designed and implemented by just local craftsmen who likely were not Jewish. And even if they were Jewish, were also building mosaics and decorative elements for churches and other houses of worship in the region. So already we have this tension that we're noticing between the moral, say, of the story as it's told in the Bible and the actual events that are happening in the space of the synagogue itself. So I want to take a look at the mosaic itself, because it's really fascinating for a lot of different reasons. So we have this sort of chaotic scene of just general construction. Things are going along as well as they could be. We have a whole system of pulleys up here, this tower and ropes and boulders being pulled up and down, people working together. And one of the things that's so interesting about this panel, and one of the reasons that I wanted to talk about it, is it's one of the few times in synagogue mosaic art that we see an explicit depiction of ethnic conflict that is depicted through racial distinction. So if we look here, we see what looks like a fight between two men, one with darker skin, one with lighter. They're grabbing onto each other. They're holding their weapons up in the air. And this sort of is a stand-in for the looming chaos that's going to emerge in the story once difference emerges in the group. And so because we're dealing with a visual media, language isn't the way that difference is depicted, but skin tone is. And I think it's really important that when we talk about race in antiquity, we're very mindful of the fact that race and racism and these terms surrounding a discourse of racial distinction are something that are distinctly modern. So these aren't really categories and distinctions that existed in the ancient world. So people in the ancient world would have noticed, for example, that people's skin color was different, but that distinction wouldn't have had any sort of value judgment associated with it. So it wouldn't be the means by which someone is identified and characterized, but rather it's just an observable difference between people, the way that we would perhaps think of height. So you're seeing these things as different, but we're not associating a value judgment with them. And so we have to be very careful when we're talking about terms like race and racism in antiquity because it's a very anachronistic way of looking at the ancient world, and we're imposing terms on the ancient world that don't really fit in with their worldview. But what we can use these terms to think about here is the way that difference is represented. And when we look at it here, and we see just different instances of people dressed differently with different skin colors, it's important to realize that the image does not create any sort of hierarchy between different ethnicities. It's just using ethnic representation to show a looming distinction between two groups. There's a whole long academic discourse about race in the ancient world, and the ways that racial discourse of the modern world has been imposed and translated into antiquity, and that I would highly encourage you, if you're interested, to go learn more about. The next thing that I think is really interesting about this panel in particular is that it shows us again this idea of a really vibrant and vital discourse around Jewish tradition and narrative. And so when we think about the story in the biblical text, the really important aspect of that story that motivates all of the action is the presence and interjection of God into the scene. When we look at this panel, we don't see any representation of God. For a long time, there was this sort of overwhelming idea that God and the divinity are never depicted in ancient Jewish art, or in Jewish art in general. But this idea doesn't really hold up and account for all of the archaeological evidence that's been found. So for example, in Beit Alpha, which is a synagogue very near the synagogue at Huqoq, there's an image of the sacrificing of Isaac that has an angelic or divine hand coming down from the sky that's interjecting into the story. So we have evidence that if the people who were commissioning this wanted to put a representation of the divine into the scene, that they could have done that, and that that was done elsewhere. So we have to think about how this story changes when God is removed in explicit terms from the story. So instead of having a representation of God, we have hints towards God's presence and hints towards the interference of a divine force in this event unfolding. So one of the ways that we see that is through these representations of conflict. So we see the result of what we know to be God's intervention from the textual account. So without explicit divine intervention, the critique of the building project becomes much more subtle. It's much harder to claim that what these people were doing here is bad if we don't actually see God coming in and interjecting on in order to stop the project. So a lot of the things that we see here that we are reading with a broader context as a divine intervention and punishment can really be understood as just normal accidents that would happen on a job site. Anyone who's ever worked anywhere knows people get in fights, maybe not this extreme, but there's often fighting and conflict in a collaborative workspace. Unfortunately, when there are large construction projects, there are accidents, people trip and fall. Without that divine judgment, this can almost be an image that's just showing or maybe even celebrating, because it's memorializing an inter-ethnic building project that is not entirely dissimilar from the project we're seeing happening at the synagogue. So when we contextualize the synagogue in a broader multicultural context, we're dampening a little bit the judgment that comes through so strongly in the textual narrative. The other thing that we start to see here is a reading of the text that also incorporates a sense of midrashic and traditional Jewish narrative and story. So one little detail that we see here is that there's, and it's sort of cut off, but there's a worker who's falling off of the top of the tower, presumably plunging to his death. And there's a traditional midrash, a Jewish story that goes along with this textual narrative that says that the people who were building the tower were so wicked and so obsessed with the construction that if a brick fell off of the tower and broke and they had to remake it, they would all cry for the lost brick. But if a person fell, no one took notice and they would just keep working. And so this story, along with the textual narrative, is an idea that's floating around general Jewish culture and consciousness at this time and is incorporated into the the visual representation we see here. So as we spoke about last time, it's really important that when we're thinking about these different sources of inspiration and influence, we're not putting them in a linear development, that there was the text and then the midrash story commentary came and then we're seeing an illustration of these things. We need to think of them in what an academic named Hindi Naiman would refer to as a constellation of ideas. So these are all different ideas and stories that are floating around and being adopted and rewritten and incorporated into different representations of the same single traditional Jewish story. So it's not that we're having an illustration of a text here that is manifest in a written form, but we're having an entirely different and equal version that is being shown to congregants who are regularly visiting this synagogue. And that's something that's really important to think about when we consider what ritual life is like in the antique world, in a largely illiterate world, where if this story was read out loud from the text itself, it was at most being read once a year, whereas someone coming to the synagogue is seeing this version of the story every single time they step in the door. So it really raises a very important question as to which forms of story and tradition we put more stock in and why. So I think our impulse might be to say that the canonical textual tradition is the one that's most important. It's the one that's been preserved for generations and passed down in what is often claimed to be the same form. But if we're thinking about the way that a story is received in a local level on a smaller time frame, this image is actually the way that people who are devoted to traditional Jewish narrative would have encountered the story on a much more regular basis. So I think that's the idea that I really want to leave you all with, is that we need to take very seriously the images and the artwork that we surround ourselves with and not think of these things as secondary to textual accounts, textual histories, textual stories that we're reading, but really think of them as an alternative and equal form of story and myth telling and making.